In 1945, Britain emerged from World War II victorious. The war was over. The enemy was defeated. The Union Jack still flew over a quarter of the world. But behind the victory parades and street parties, a devastating truth was unfolding, a secret that was never announced to the public. Britain was broke. Not just strained, not just weakened, financially exhausted. Britain had won the war, but in doing so, it had lost something far more fundamental: its economic independence. This wasn't just the result of enemy bombs. It was the staggering cost of survival itself. World War II had drained the nation's economy on a scale never seen before. 6 years of total war had vaporized gold reserves, forced the sale of overseas assets, and pushed the national debt to catastrophic levels. By the time peace arrived, Britain could no longer afford the empire it had spent centuries building. The bill for that victory didn't just vanish in 1945. It arrived silently, in the form of debt. This isn't a story about generals or battles. It's the story of how a military victory reshaped the global balance of power, and how the United States replaced Britain as the world's financial leader without firing a single shot. Before the war, Britain was an undisputed economic titan. London was the world's financial capital. The pound sterling was a global currency. British investments generated massive income from across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. But the war changed everything. From 1939 onwards, Britain was spending far more than it earned. It had to import food, fuel, weapons, and raw materials just to keep fighting. The entire economy was redirected towards one single goal: survival. To pay for it all, Britain began selling its future. Gold reserves were shipped across the Atlantic. Foreign investments, assets built up over generations, were liquidated for short-term survival. By the early 1940s, those reserves were almost gone. Britain faced a brutal choice: stop fighting and surrender, or accept financial dependence on the only country left with the resources to help. That country was the United States. While Europe burned, America remained untouched by the physical destruction of war. Its factories were humming, its economy was booming, and it held the financial power that Britain had lost. But American support wasn't charity. It was a financial arrangement with conditions, a deal that would quietly and permanently shift the center of global power. So, as Britain celebrated its triumph on the battlefield, its economic fate was being sealed. Victorious in war, it was no longer in control of its own destiny. From that moment on, the decline of the British Empire wasn't just a possibility, it was inevitable. World War II did not bankrupt Britain overnight. It happened step by step through decisions made under pressure. When the war began in 1939, Britain understood one thing clearly: this would not be a cheap conflict. Britain was an island nation, heavily dependent on imports. Food, oil, raw materials, and weapons all had to be brought in from abroad. And war immediately disrupted global trade. To keep fighting, Britain had to spend far more than it earned. At first, it relied on what it already had. Gold reserves stored in British and overseas vaults were shipped out to pay for supplies. Foreign investments, railways, utilities, businesses across the empire were sold off. These were not minor assets. They were the financial backbone of Britain's global power. This was not a strategy for growth. It was survival mode. By 1940, Britain had already liquidated a large portion of its overseas wealth. What had taken generations to build was being exchanged for months of wartime funding. But the war dragged on. Air raids intensified. Military spending soared. Imports increased. Exports collapsed. By 1941, Britain faced a hard truth. It was running out of money. At that point, there was only one place left to turn: the United States. America was in a very different position. Its cities were untouched. Its factories were expanding. Its gold reserves were the largest in the world. But American assistance was not free in the long term. Britain received access to supplies it desperately needed. But this came at the cost of economic leverage. The relationship was no longer equal. Britain was no longer financing the war independently. It was borrowing time and influence. As the war continued, Britain's national debt exploded. By the end of the conflict, debt had reached levels never seen before in British history. Interest payments alone became a long-term burden on the economy. Even worse, Britain's ability to earn dollars collapsed. Exports were weak, industry was exhausted, and global trade increasingly operated on American terms. This created a dangerous imbalance. Britain needed dollars to rebuild, but it no longer had the economic strength to generate them. The empire, once a source of income, became an expense. Maintaining global control required money Britain no longer possessed. By 1945, the war had been won, but Britain's financial foundation was shattered. The empire still existed on maps, but economically, it was already hollow, and the real cost of that hollow victory was about to be revealed. When World War II ended, Britain expected recovery. The fighting was over. Factories could return to civilian production. Trade could restart. Life in theory should have improved. Instead, Britain entered one of the hardest economic periods in its modern history. The reason was simple. The war had ended, but the debts had not. Britain emerged from 1945 with an exhausted economy, Its infrastructure was worn down, its industries were outdated, exports were weak, and foreign currency reserves were almost gone. Yet Britain still needed to import food, fuel, and raw materials just to function. That meant one thing: Britain needed dollars. But dollars were controlled by the United States. To avoid total economic collapse, Britain negotiated a massive post-war loan from the U.S. In 1946, on the surface, this loan was presented as assistance for reconstruction. In reality, it came with conditions that reshaped Britain's future. One of the most damaging conditions was currency convertibility. Britain agreed that its currency could be freely exchanged for U.S. dollars. This decision was meant to restore confidence in international trade. Instead, it triggered a crisis. As soon as the pound became convertible, foreign holders rushed to exchange it for dollars. Britain's already limited reserves drained at an alarming speed. Within weeks, the country was forced to suspend convertibility. The damage was done. Britain faced a severe balance of payments crisis. Imports exceeded exports. Dollars flowed out faster than they came in. The economy entered a prolonged period of austerity. Rationing, instead of ending after the war, continued for years. Food shortages persisted. Living standards stagnated. Public frustration grew. Victory had not brought prosperity. It had brought restraint. At the same time, maintaining a global empire became economically impossible. Colonies required administration, military presence, and investment. All of this cost money Britain no longer had. The empire was no longer profitable. It was a liability. Independence movements gained momentum, not only because of political pressure, but because Britain lacked the resources to resist or manage them. One by one, territories slipped away. Not through dramatic collapse, but through quiet withdrawal. The post-war loan kept Britain afloat in the short term, but it locked the country into long-term dependence. The bill for World War II had arrived, and Britain would be paying it for decades. While Britain struggled to stabilize its economy, the United States was moving in the opposite direction. World War II had transformed America. Unlike Europe, the U.S. mainland had suffered no destruction. Its cities were intact. Its factories had expanded rather than collapsed. Its workforce was skilled, mobilized, and productive. By 1945, the United States controlled an overwhelming share of global manufacturing output. It held most of the world's gold reserves, and it possessed the only major economy capable of financing reconstruction on a global scale. This imbalance mattered, because power in the modern world is not decided only by territory. It is decided by money, trade, and credit. Before the war, Britain had played this role. London financed global commerce. The pound sterling anchored international trade. Empires functioned through economic networks as much as military ones. After the war, that system no longer existed. The global economy was reorganized around the US dollar. International trade increasingly required access to American currency. Reconstruction depended on American financing. Economic stability depended on American approval. Britain, once the center of this system, became dependent on it. This did not happen through conquest. It happened through structure. Britain could no longer protect imperial trade preferences. It could no longer subsidize distant territories. It could no longer afford large overseas military commitments. Every major decision now had an economic limit, and those limits were defined by access to dollars. The United States did not replace Britain by taking its colonies. It replaced Britain by controlling the system that made empires possible. This marked a fundamental change in how global power worked. The old model was territorial empire. The new model was financial dominance. Britain still had influence. It still had alliances, but it no longer set the rules. From this point onward, British policy increasingly aligned with American economic priorities. Not because of force, but because alternatives were financially impossible. The empire slowly unraveled, not in a single moment, but through a series of economic constraints. Decisions that once would have been political became financial calculations, and those calculations almost always ended the same way. Withdrawal. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the direction was clear. The British Empire was fading. The American-led order was expanding. The war had not destroyed Britain's influence overnight, but it had ensured that the future would belong to someone else. And that shift would define the second half of the 20th century. When World War II ended, Britain was on the winning side of history. The Axis powers were defeated. Europe was liberated, and Britain's role in that victory was undeniable. But this triumph came with a hidden price tag, one that wasn't immediately obvious. Britain emerged from the war completely exhausted. Economically, financially, and structurally, the nation had spent everything it had just to survive. Its gold reserves were gone. Its valuable overseas assets had been sold off, and its national debt had skyrocketed to levels never seen before. What was left was an empire that could no longer support itself. The war didn't destroy the British Empire in a single, dramatic blow. Instead, it dismantled the very foundations that made empire possible in the first place. You see, empires require a surplus. They need extra money, trade advantages, and the ability to project power without it breaking the bank. After 1945, Britain had none of these. Every major decision became a question of cost. Every overseas commitment required American dollars that Britain simply didn't have. Every attempt to maintain its global influence ran into economic brick walls that couldn't be ignored. Now, the United States didn't dismantle the British Empire with military force. It didn't seize territories or demand surrender. It simply became the new center of the global financial system. And in that new system, Britain was no longer the dominant player. The pound sterling, once the world's currency, faded from the global stage, and the US dollar took its place. The flow of money for trade, reconstruction, and global stability now ran through American institutions. Britain had to adapt, but adaptation meant accepting a smaller role on the world stage. Colonies gained their independence, not just because they fought for it, but because Britain could no longer afford to govern them. The empire didn't collapse in a blaze of glory. It quietly dissolved, one withdrawal at a time, as the economic reality set in. What's important to understand is that this isn't a story about blame. The United States didn't punish Britain. Britain wasn't betrayed. This was simply the cold, hard logic of economics. The war shifted the global balance of power. Debt transferred influence, and finance replaced military might as the ultimate tool of power. World War II didn't end British greatness, but it did end Britain's position as the world's leading superpower. From that moment on, global leadership belonged to the nation that controlled credit, currency, and the keys to reconstruction. The war created a new world order. Britain helped win that war, but it could no longer afford to lead the world it helped create. And that is the true, hidden cost of World War II. It wasn't measured in battles or casualties, but in the quiet, irreversible transfer of power from one empire to another. Thanks for watching.